Nigeria's foreign exchange reserves rose from $34.94 billion last November to $36.23 billion by January 21st, 2020, on the back of increase in global crude oil prices. According to the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Mr. Godwin Emefiele, the increase reflected improvements in crude prices and partial global economic recovery amid optimism over the discovery and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines by most developed economies. Mr. Emefiele also says the nation's economy and its global counterparts had continued to show prospects for recovery from the effects of COVID-19, reiterating that there will be an improved economic growth in Nigeria in the first quarter of 2020. Nigeria's Monetary Policy Committee at its last meeting retained the interest rate at 11.5% alongside all key parameters like the liquidity ratio, cash reserve ratio, as well as the asymmetric corridor. Before the meeting, analysts had projected that the central bank may loosen its liquidity ratio to control the rate of excess money in circulation in the face of rising inflation in the country. But for the committee, which was confined in a tight space as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and trend of negative growth contraction, retained its interest rates for the second time since 2020. In its defense, the CBN says the Apex Bank pursued a systematic synchronization of monetary and fiscal policy accommodation through its developmental financial initiatives aimed at mitigating the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Nigerians. Well, let's now discuss the impact of the committee monetary policies direction to curb inflation and, of course, to improve growth. Joining me live from Abuja studios is the chairman of Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria. Is also a professor of capital markets, Professor Uche Uwaleke. Thank you very much for your time, Prof.
Thank you, Tolu. It's my pleasure.
Prof, I know you must have been asked this question. What were you expecting after that meeting before we go into details? Were you expecting that retention, or were you expecting a shift because of what we had in regards to inflation and other issues we've been grappling with?
Yeah, I told you I expected a hold position, and that's what came out. So I wasn't surprised that the members chose to maintain status quo. It's not for nothing, really, that all 10 members voted. It was a unanimous decision to maintain the rates. And you'll recall that this was also the scenario that played out in November. All 10 members who voted to hold the rates. And between November and now, of course, not much has changed. You see, the central bank is faced with a dilemma. The dilemma of reigning inflation on the one hand, rising inflation on the one hand. As you know, inflation rate has been climbing as of last month. The numbers from MBS puts it at 15.75%, and that's just talking about the headline inflation, if you like, year on year. The food component of that is a lot higher at 19.5%. That is where the pressure point is coming. So and the central bank has a mandate of maintaining price stability. So on the one hand, that is a challenge. On the other hand, too, you have output contraction. The latest figure we have, is that of third quarter of 2020, in which the economy tanked by 3.62%. Although from a high of 6.1% in the second quarter. Even though that the output contraction, was a consideration, just as inflation, rising inflation rate, was also a consideration. So that's the dilemma the MPC found itself, and in resolving that dilemma, MPC chose to, if you like, adopt a wait-and-see attitude, because in decision making, really, do nothing can be an option. So in this case, MPC chose to do nothing and then wait and see how events unfold. Don't forget that this is January, and historically, MPC is not, if you take on the average, MPC is not known to adjust rates in the month of January. So the month of January is the month where you sit and watch, and especially when you had maybe tinkered with rates the previous year. So you want to see how that permeates through the economy before you begin to respond. Let me also say this, that unlike what obtains in other climes, we have a situation where you have rising inflation and economic recession, that's stagflation. In other climes, especially in developed countries, and including many emerging economies, you have the economy going down, inflation rates also going down, so it's easier to handle. In the US, for example, the Federal Reserve is currently being bugged. What is bugging the Federal Reserve at the moment is how to tush up even the inflation rate to meet its target of 2%. Inflation rate is well below 2%. And of course, the Federal Reserve, in a bid to stimulate the economy in the US, has been cutting rates such that today rates are at near zero level, where it can't cut any longer, which is why it's resorting to some unconventional measures in order to do that, namely asset purchase programs. Ditto for European Central Bank, ditto for Bank of England, and we also the Bank of Japan, doing same. But in Nigeria here, we have a case where inflation is rising, output is contracting. So if you apply measures to check inflation, its output is suffering, and if you decide to also address output, inflation is is at the expense of inflation. So at the beginning of the year, it made sense for the central bank, for MPC of the central bank, to choose to hold the rates, maintain the status quo. So that was my expectation, and the expectation was met.
Now, Prof, something that we need to also identify with is the fact that the resurgence of COVID-19, talking about the second wave, like it's called in this climb, and also the mild success recovered, they're talking about COVID-19 vaccines, and also the kind of recovery that we expect. The CBN governor talked that said all of this will dampen recovery. Now, to you, what kind of recovery do you now see? We've had projections before now from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, and we've had reprojections. With all of this in the plate, we have to grapple with. What kind of recovery are we looking at? We're still going to look at supply chain disruptions and all of this, the effect on the economy, but what are we really projecting? 2021, what kind of year do you see? Professor Waloke. Okay, I think we need to. All right, Professor Waloke, if you can hear me. Professor Waloke, I was asking you about issues around the second wave of COVID-19 and the global effect, the global impact. Nigeria is not insulated from this. What do you think would happen to Africa's most populous nation at this time?
Yes, I think of course, it's going to distort plans, the rising wave of COVID, and we hope it gets contained, which was why the MPC had also advised the government to adopt a different strategy this time, a strategy that is different from imposing lockdowns, because lockdowns will further hurt the economy. As we saw, in 2020. So the approach this time should be more more of sensitizing the population and creating awareness and ensuring that preventive measures, are in place and are being enforced. And I'm happy, as you know, the president just signed a bill, coming from the National Assembly, making it mandatory for people to wear face masks, especially in the public. I think that will go a long way in reducing the rate of infections that we have in this country. So if we adopt that approach and open up the economy, fully, I think that we may end up having the economy turn the corner by the first quarter of before the end of the first quarter of 2021, as has been projected. Of course, you know that even the IMF, revised its projections for not only for the global economy, but for Nigeria. So the outlook is actually positive if you discount the negative impact of COVID. And of course, the vaccines that are already being rolled out now will also help in any effort that's been put at the global level or even at domestic level to revamp the economy.
Prof, we also have to cope with deregulation of the downstream, which actually has put the price of PMS, or people call petrol, on the high side. And that will continue even as the price of crude continues to rise. Also hiking electricity tariff and the effect of the lockdown, which small businesses are grappling with. As a Nigerian, what are we, just as a normal Nigerian, average Nigerian, what kind of year do you see for us?
Yes, I'm positive about 2021. There's no doubt about that. That is in terms of economic performance, macroeconomic performance is going to be a lot better than 2020. And I've given you reasons, one of which is the fact that we may not have the COVID-19 challenge may not be as severe as we had it in 2020. And the indications are even there. If you notice, the contraction we had in the third quarter of 2020 was a lot milder than what we had in the second quarter of 2020. So it would appear that the economy is already headed, northwards. And I see the economy coming out of the recession in 2021. Of course, the issue of inflation, is there. The government is projecting that inflation rate will come in at 11.95% by the end of 2021. But that will be possible if the major factors driving inflation in Nigeria, are addressed. As you know, these factors are not necessarily demand pull factors. They are more of cost push coming from supply side shortages, which is why the central bank is falling back now, appears to be falling back now more on its development finance intervention. So a lot of these interventions, I believe, will go a long way in stimulating the economy. If the supply side is addressed, for me, it's going to be a silver bullet. If we have interventions in the agri-value chain, for example, and that results in an increase in output. If you have increase in aggregate supply, that will go a long way in moderating prices. It will also go a long way in increasing the contributions of, say, the agri sector. Agri sector contributes about 30% to GDP. So the contribution of the agri sector to GDP will increase. And in other sectors too, where we're having these interventions. Interventions are being recorded in manufacturing, in in the power sector, and so on. So these interventions, if they are well targeted, I believe they will work to improve output. And if output is increased, inflation rate will come down. And at the same time, you're also having an increase in GDP. The PIB is a welcome development, and I'm happy the National Assembly is giving it all the seriousness that it deserves. There is no doubt that the petroleum industry bill will further open up that sector and attract investments in that sector. When we have increased investments in that sector, when we get to a point where we can now produce enough PMS in the country, we no longer import PMS. Of course, you know, the positive impact is going to have on the exchange rate, on even inflation, because part of why you have this pressure on exchange rate is because we are importing petroleum products. So if we stop importing petroleum products, we conserve forex, and we also have enough for domestic consumption, and that may even lead to, with competition, that may even bring down the prices of petroleum products. So PIB is a welcome development, and as I said earlier on, the National Assembly is trying to fast track its passage, and once that happens, I'm very sure the economy will be better for it.
Indeed, that will be a very good one. Talking PIB, Prof, targeted interventions by the Central Bank of Nigeria. Yes, you talked about agriculture. We've also seen in the pharmaceutical space. We've seen in the textile space and even power sector, talking about meters now, central bank supporting government, providing meters. But another thing that the central bank talked about is stimulus packages. We've seen what's happened in the US, in the UK, in China, and other countries around. But when you look at the percentage to GDP in Nigeria, we have just 4.5%, very low here. Do you see the Apex Bank doing better, or you think it has to be the monetary and the fiscal side to support packages like this to at least help cushion the effect of all of these negatives?
Yes, I want to believe that the central bank, will do more in 2021, because it's important that these interventions are scaled up because of the size of the problem. The problem is huge, and the much that has been done so far, even by the admittance of the central bank governor, has been very, very little. In terms of a percentage to GDP, is about the least, just 4%. A country like South Africa here has done over 10%. So it's important that these interventions are ramped up. You have a situation where in a country of millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises. Okay, if you look at the number of MSMEs that have really accessed these funds, it's quite insignificant compared to the number of micro, small, and medium enterprises we have in this country. So that's why I said it's important that the figure is, interventions are expanded, particularly the ones that are in employment elastic sectors. Manufacturing is there, agriculture is there, construction is there. And let me also say that this intervention by the central bank, helped in no small measure in moderating the contraction that we had in the third quarter of 2020. And they are also likely to further moderate the one we are going to record by the end of 2020. So it's important that they are ramped up. On the fiscal side, the challenge there is the fiscal room is very, very narrow. The government is having this revenue challenge, as you know. The only option they have to be able to ramp up interventions will be to borrow. And the government has borrowed, so much. But the central bank can afford to do that because, it has the capacity, to relative to the federal government to do so. The federal government, the central bank, through Ways and Means, for example, can, of course, put more money out there. But the fear is always, if you use Ways and Means to put money, inflation rate is there, But that's, again, because of the fact that the productive capacity of the economy is shallow. If we are a producing nation, okay, this is the time to pump more money into the economy, as is being done in other countries. In the US, for example, the the Federal Reserve, the government at the center is also pumping money, especially during this period of COVID-19, to stimulate growth. The new government in the U.S. is also talking about putting more money, in the economy. It's even talking about increasing the minimum wage, in the U.S. And all this will happen because the U.S. economy can absorb it. Inflation rate is, very, very, very low there. So I think too, if the interventions by the central bank are in productive sectors, okay, then the issue of inflation really may not present a major challenge, because you're going to have increased output, and if output increases, even when you're increasing consumer demand, or on the demand side, the equilibrium level will not be so high that you will have a case where maybe inflation will be out of control. So I think interventions are necessary, especially if they are in employment elastic areas, productive areas that will further create jobs and increase output in the economy.
Finally, two-in-one question now, Prof. Money market also remains very low at this time, talking about money market rates, and the switch is now, the focus is on the equities market. Do you see that trend continuing in 2021 with local investors still dominating the market? And on the other side, Nigeria will repay a $500 million Euro bond maturing this month. What do you make of that?
Yes, of course, the bullish equities market we had in 2020, and we are still witnessing now, is because of the low yields in the money market. So investors' preference shifted to equities. So as long as that low interest rate regime remains, we are likely to continue to see preference for equities. And I think a low interest rate environment is, what we actually need now. We don't need to try to hike rates, because if we hike rates, lending rates, the gap between lending and saving rates is already high. So if interest rates are up, of course, lending rates will further, that gap will continue to widen. And another danger of having a high rates, especially for money market instruments, is the fact that people no longer do real investments. They keep putting money in things like, yes, money market instruments. Okay, when they can, invest, in other areas. That is not helping the economy. So I think a low interest rate environment it should be sustained. But that may not happen. I see that changing, maybe by the middle of the year or in the third quarter, especially after this COVID-19 pandemic, because the moment the banks in developed countries, central banks in developed countries, begin to normalize interest rates, the moment the Federal Reserve, for example, begins to normalize interest rates, now we also begin to see, investments, go in there. So for us to attract foreign investors, we may need to increase rates, and as I said, that may happen, before the end of the year. But as long as the rates are low now, the equities market will continue to attract patronage. Now, on the issue of Euro bonds, that has always been the danger, and that has always been why, personally, I have preferred obtaining loans from either multilateral institutions or bilateral institutions. Issuing Euro bonds, has its own drawbacks. One of which is we have exchange rate risk, and another is the nature of the repayment. It's bullet repayment, and the investors are not the type you negotiate with. So in this period of the pandemic, in this period of economic downturn, you could get a reprieve, for example, from multilateral creditors. You could get debt forgiveness from even your bilateral creditors, but you cannot do so with the people that have invested in your securities that you put out there in the international capital market. So we have to use those instruments, with caution. Again, of course, Eurobonds are more expensive than other, asset classes from the issuer's, point of view, and that is why in our debt structure we should pay more emphasis on concessional loans as opposed to these ones that come from the international capital market. Indeed. If we can't do that, if we can avoid it, let us avoid it. But the way it is now, we will have to pay, and of course that will hit our external reserves. The external reserves will suffer because of that, and it may also affect the exchange rates, ability of the central bank to intervene anytime exchange rates, the foreign reserves, drop.
All right, Professor Uche Owaleke-Diamonds, thank you very much for your time. Live from Abuja, Professor of Capital Markets and the President of the Capital Markets, Academics of Nigeria. I appreciate your time on the show.